I don't know if anybody golfs, but if you know anything at all about golf, Bobby Jones arguably was one of the greatest golfers of all time. If he wasn't the greatest, he certainly was. He certainly is in that pantheon of top 5 of all golfers. He was a man of great integrity. He was intense, obsessive, even had a temper. And he suffered for most of his life with syringomyelia, which is a spinal disease. It eventually relegated him to a wheelchair at the age of 48. Bobby Jones is the only man to win golf's Grand Slam, albeit the tournaments were slightly different in his era. And he did it all in the same calendar year. He did it all within 4 months of each event. And this was at a time which included travel by boat to Europe for both the British Open and the St. Andrews for the British Amateur. And he only golfed part-time 3 months out of the year. And for his entire career, he remained an amateur. He never went professional. In 1925, in the US Open, he was, as an amateur, golfing against professional golfers of his day, some of the best in the world, and his longtime friendly adversary, Walter Hagen. He gets to one of the holes, and unfortunately, he gets to one of the tees, and unfortunately he drives the ball into the rough. He's in a wooded area. The ball can't be seen. He has to go and retrieve it. He's standing in the rough. He approaches the ball. Unseen by anyone, Walter Hagen, the referee, the gallery, the other golfers, no one could see. He stops, he goes to the referee, and he goes to Walter Hagen, and he says, I have to assign a penalty of 1 stroke to myself. And Hagen and the referee look at him and they go, what are you talking about, Bobby? He said, when I addressed the ball and I moved my club over the top of the ball, I brushed the ball and the ball moved. Nobody saw it. Hagen didn't see it. The referee didn't see it. Hagen argued with Bobby Jones right there on the fairway, telling him, it's not a penalty, nobody saw it. And he said, no, I moved the ball. The referee looked at him and said, Mr. Jones, I didn't see it. And Bobby said, but I did. He said, you have to assess a 1-stroke penalty. And the legend goes that the referee looked at Bobby Jones and said, Mr. Jones, that's an amazing thing you just did. To which Bobby replied, sir, that's like complimenting a bank robber for not robbing a bank. This was the man. Not only did he do it once, the very next year he did it again at the Scioto Country Club in Columbus, Ohio. The difference between the 2 events, he was 8 strokes ahead in Columbus and won that match going away. In 25 against Walter Hagen, he lost the US Open by 1 stroke. Bobby Jones was a man of immense integrity. The first time he played St. Andrews, the old course, it was so brutal, he quit midway through the match. After the 11th tee, he walked off. I hate this place. "I hate Scotland." To which the British press said, "Mr. Jones is more a boy than a man." Years later, Bobby would return to Scotland. He would fall in love with the old course. And when he won the Grand Slam and he won St. Andrews, he stood before the crowd, he held the trophy up, and he said, "It would do me honor if you would allow me to leave the trophy here where it belongs and not take it home with me." Bobby Jones died very young. He converted to Rome from Presbyterianism just before he passed away. But by all accounts, he was a man that stood above all men. In the 20s, which was considered the golden era of sports, he was considered one of the 5 greatest athletes in the United States. He was ranked with Babe Ruth, Red Grange, Jack Dempsey, and Big Bill Tilden. The shadow that this man casts is remarkable. Why do I mention Bobby Jones? Because that brings us to this morning's gospel. We see this morning the actual conception of the King. Now, we've been talking about the King through Advent and Christmas, and I spoke on Christmas Day of the birth of the King, but this is the actual conception. Joseph was betrothed to Mary. Suddenly, she's with child. Joseph, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, wanted to put her away. But the Lord came to Joseph, said, "Don't do this. There's something special going on here. You're going to have a son. You're going to name him Jesus. He's going to save his people from their sins. You're going to call him Emmanuel. You're going to recognize that he is God with us." And then Joseph, after having heard this in a dream from God, took Mary to be his wife. I want to talk about 3 things this morning. I want to talk about the man, I want to talk about the birth of the Son, and then I want to talk about the divine intervention. If Bobby Jones was an example for us as humans, Joseph transcends even Bobby. Joseph was betrothed to Mary, and when we think of Jewish betrothal, we have to make sure we do not confuse it with present-day engagement. For a Jew, it was far more serious, and it was far more binding to be betrothed. For all intents and purposes, a betrothal at that time was a legally binding marriage. And you've heard me preach on the marriage supper of the Lamb. You heard me a few years ago talk about that whole procedure of what is involved in the Jewish marriage. The choosing of the father who chooses what will be worn by the guests. The betrothal of the spouses to one another. The waiting period, then the coming together. Here is an example of that situation in microcosm. Joseph was betrothed to Mary, and let us not have any doubt they were husband and wife, because in verse 19 we see that Joseph is called her husband, and in verse 20 Mary is called his wife. They were married for all intents and purposes. Her pregnancy then, according to Old Testament law, as a result of alleged unfaithfulness or adultery in a betrothed woman was worthy of the death penalty. Deuteronomy 22. But Joseph loved Mary, and Joseph wanted to have her with him as his wife forever. But above all, Joseph was a righteous man. Joseph was a man of principle. Yet his principled righteousness was also kind-hearted. So you see, Joseph comes to this situation in the same way that Bobby Jones was alone. There was nobody there. Joseph knew she was pregnant. What was he going to do in the quiet of his heart? That Joseph was a righteous man refers to an even more basic quality of that just being mentioned. It refers to one who is so scrupulous to keep the law. And as a law-abiding man, Joseph would be expected to repudiate the immorality of his fiancée and publicly bring her forth for trial. And if you want to understand what that's like, read Colossians 2, because it is in Colossians 2 where we see Jesus making a public display, a mockery of the principalities and powers, those he defeated at the cross. Joseph did not want to do this to his wife Mary. So if righteousness is understood in that sense, it stands in contrast with, rather than an explanation of, his desire to spare her. He shouldn't have spared her if he was a righteous man, according to the law. So in other words, Joseph was willing to suffer whatever indignities, whatever hardships, whatever slanders were to be brought on Mary, and he was willing to suffer it himself for her. There's no explanation as to why Joseph remains abstinent after he takes Mary for his wife. Maybe it was out of reverence for the holy child that was in her. Maybe it was to ensure that there was no doubt that he was not the father. But in any case, there is no indication that it has anything to do with a concern to maintain a perpetual virginity for Mary. And this has been a constant issue amongst Protestants and non-Protestants. It is a tenet of faith in Rome. Greek Orthodoxy doesn't, quote unquote, demand you believe it, but they really look askance if you don't. The sad part is, for most of church history, the church basically allowed your conscience to be the decider on that. If you believed she was perpetually a virgin, fine. If you didn't, okay. Well, since the church allows me to exercise my conscience, I want to bring three things to your attention. Number one, according to both the Old and New Testament, sexual intercourse for married couples is divinely approved. Genesis 1:28, Genesis 9:1, 24:60, Proverbs 5:18, Psalm 127:3, and of course 1 Corinthians 7, 5 through 9. In addition, though abstinence or celibacy is a gift, there's no prescription for this to occur in a marital relationship, which would seem rather counterintuitive at best. Nor is there any special sanctity attached to complete celibacy or abstinence. Number two, there's no question that in Scripture we see Jesus had brothers and sisters. Jesus evidently was one of a member of a large family. Matthew 12, 46 and 47, Mark 3, 31, 32, Mark 6, 3, Luke 8, 19 and 20, John 2, 12, John 7, 3 through 10, and Acts 1, 1, 14. And lest somebody tell you that those references refer to an extended family, it was custom for the Jews at that time to have large collections of relatives living in the house. Even Bill O'Reilly is pushing forth that view in his book, which would make sense since he's a Roman. Keep this in mind. There are two words that are used. One, adelphos, which means brother, and that's the word that's primarily used in the texts that I just read. The one for relative, which is what O'Reilly and the others identify as those related to Jesus, those living in the house. The Greek word for that is an entirely different word. Sungenes is the word. So, you can't make that claim scripturally. And lastly, Luke 2:7 states specifically that Jesus was Mary's firstborn, which in and of itself doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't make sense if he's the only one. Why not say Jesus was Mary's only child instead of firstborn? So you combine that with the previous points, you unite all three of those with verse 25, which says, then Joseph knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. He knew her not. Obviously, he was engaged to the woman, so it had nothing to do with cognitive understanding of who this woman was living in his house. He didn't wake up one morning and say, I have no idea who you are. What are you doing here? He knew who she was. Knew, obviously, is used in the context of intimacy. And firstborn, I think, speaks for itself in this context. So there's no doubt that Jesus was a sibling. He had biological brothers and sisters, of whom he is the oldest. He is the firstborn. Mary was a traditional bride. She was sexually active with her husband Joseph. She was not perpetually a virgin. So let's talk about the Son. Notice the way that the gospel writers refer to this. There's a very delicate way in which both Matthew and Luke express the process of Jesus' conception. And it sharply contrasts with what was going on in the pagan world. The stories of Greek and Roman gods taking on human or animal forms, engaging in sexual congress with human women that resulted in the birth of demigods, half-breeds, heroes, such as Hercules or Horus, for that matter. Now, what we see in the gospel account is pure divinity and pure humanity. There was no intermixing. What we see in the way that the gospel writers present the birth of Christ, we see something entirely new. We see a new creation. We see that God brought forth Adam and Eve as something entirely new. He brought them forth from the ground. They were different than all the other creatures that God had created. This was something new. And we see in the conception of Christ a new creation. We see something entirely new. The overarching metaphor of the creation runs like a thread from the first man, first Adam, to the second Adam. We talk about the second Adam in Romans, but the second Adam starts right here. Now, I want to take a second, just a brief second. I mentioned on Christmas Day the nonsense about Christianity stealing December 25th from paganism and Christianizing it. And I pointed out that where that came from, that was a 17th century creation that is not ancient, etc. Well, we run into the same thing with the birth of Christ. One of the more common myths going around today You can hear it on Bill Maher at any given time. He'll spout it off because he knows nothing about anything when it comes to history or theology. Is the Jesus story is nothing more than a plagiarizing of the story of Horace. And if you're on Facebook, Charles posted a fantastic 5-minute sarcastic, satirical take on this that is absolutely hysterical. But let me give you just a couple of points. Horace was said to have been born of a virgin on December 25th, and that there was an individual named Anna the Baptizer that came forth to announce his birth. He died, he was crucified, and then he rose again 3 days later. That's the story of Horace. One problem. None of that happened. You cannot find in the original literature any of that. There is no evidence in Egyptian literature or any primary ancient Near Eastern sources that Horace was crucified and resurrected 3 days later. There is no evidence in the Egyptian literature or any primary ancient Near Eastern sources for a figure named Anna the Baptizer. Horace's mother was the goddess Isis, and his father was Osiris. And they are said to have engaged in normal sex, well, as gods can engage in normal sexual relationships, out of which Horus was conceived. Isis was not a virgin. There is no specific date anywhere tied to the birth of Horus. It's not documented. All of this comes from a discredited, self-taught 19th century fool named Gerald Massey. We know the source. The problem is it's perpetuated by people who are popular, like Tom Harper and Alvin Boyd, and many others. Ward Gask, Harvard PhD, Manchester University, who is no friend of Christianity, I shouldn't say that, he's neo-Orthodox, sent emails to 20 Egyptologists that he considered to be the leaders in their field, including Kenneth Kitchen of Liverpool and Ron Lepron of the University of Toronto. Sent it to Canada, the United States, Britain, Australia, Germany, everywhere, to verify these assertions that indirectly dealt with Massey. Of the 2010 responded, of them, they were unanimous in dismissing the proposed similarities between Jesus and Horus. One went so far as to say Boyd was involved in comparison, and his comparison was fringe nonsense. If you want to read a detailed destruction of this view, I recommend you go to the book Come Let Us Reason by William Lane Craig and Paul Copan. There's a chapter by Mark Foreman of Liberty University. He destroys this whole nonsense. If you have the time, you can sit at your computer, watch it on YouTube, because he gave a 60-minute lecture. It's devastating. The fact of the matter is there's nothing comparable anywhere in any literature to the birth of Christ. Why? Because this is divine involvement. Look at the text. God is continually involved throughout this very short section in communicating with Joseph, and it goes on to the first couple verses of chapter 2. 4 times in the first 2 chapters do we see God taking the initiative and guiding Joseph's actions during this critical period. 3 times it is directly stated that the angel of the Lord communicated with Joseph. Once it's implied that it was the angel. This is an intrusion of the divine into the earthly. This is God being involved in a recreation, a new creature, something utterly different. So despite his previous decision put my wife away quietly. I don't want to publicly embarrass her. Joseph is called to take two decisive actions. Number one, he is told by God to accept Mary as his wife rather than repudiating her. And he is told to give this child a name which will confirm the legal recognition of Jesus as Joseph's son, and hence, bless you, a son of David. This element of accruing a name is crucial. Look at what Matthew is saying. Pay close attention. The child's name is Jesus. God saves. Or, as would have been more familiar to the Jews, he will save, or Yahweh is salvation. The symbolic reference to him is Emmanuel, God with us. Or, if you go to Psalm 130, verse 8, he will save his people from their sins. The Old Testament spoke of God as a Savior. Mary's Son is himself to be the agent of that salvation. Here is a profound Christological reflection on the part of Matthew and any of his readers who can see behind the common Greek name to its origin would understand this. Matthew even uses the special term Laos, people, to identify that this Messiah, this Son, this individual who is the product of divine involvement, would come for Yahweh's people first. In these short verses in Matthew, we see a Christological neon sign. We see Matthew screaming to his Jewish readers, Yahweh is coming to save. His people, in relation to the mission of a son of David, must, in the first place, denote Israel. The invitation to all the peoples of all nations, of all tongues and kinds, is not yet understood or even recognized by the Jews. They wouldn't have seen the import of the title Son of Abraham to include non-Jews. Note, again, in the first chapter of Matthew, even with the reference to the non-Jewish women in the genealogy of Christ. Did you ever notice that in Jesus' genealogy? There are non-Jews, and they are women. Tamar points to Judah's sin. Rahab was the harlot. Ruth was a Moabite, and we all know Bathsheba. She was a Hittite, and she led to David's downfall. This is an Ellery Queen novel for the average Jew. This is Agatha Christie. All of the clues are before you, folks. Can you not see? He will come for his people. His people will be identified as sons of Abraham. And they will include the people of all nations, tribes, and tongues. And notice one other thing that shouts to us that we probably wouldn't understand if we weren't Jews. Matthew draws attention to God's intervention of previous barren women. Here's a young girl with no husband, quote unquote, having known no man. Yet there's a miraculous child that comes from her. Sarah had a miraculous child come from her because Sarah was barren. Rachel had miraculous children come from her. She was barren. And of course, Hannah prayed and prayed and prayed. And God gave her Samuel. Even in these short, brief hints in Matthew's genealogy, we see the grandeur and the far-reaching effects of God's salvific acts. He gives us a righteous man. He gives us this man to protect this woman. He directly involves himself in this man's life. He creates something entirely new in this woman. And with this creative act, with this new creation, with this divine intervention, God sets forth a theological treatise in the first chapter of Matthew that could rival any systematic theology. Salvation has come. It has come to his people. His people will be identified as sons of Abraham. The sons of Abraham will include all nations, all tribes, all tongues. He has shown us that he has the power of life because he can create life out of barrenness. And his salvation and his arm cannot be shortened. So when you look at this, do you ask yourself, what type of person are you? Do you have the integrity to do what is right even when no one's looking? Like Bobby Jones or Joseph? Do you love the law of the Lord so much that everything you think, do, or say is governed by it, like Joseph? I know Christians who give little thought to the law of God as a means of informing our spiritual life and our sanctification. I know Anglicans who will recite the law and not even realize or care that they violated. I recently had an exchange with someone on Facebook who openly lied and violated the 9th commandment. Bear false witness. And I don't think this person was aware of it. Does your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees? The mere externalism? The doing the things because, oh, well, that's what we've always done. That's the tradition. Do you recognize that this Messiah, this God with us, this one who will save his people from their sins, came to redeem you even when you're not righteous? Even when you're not obeying the 9th commandment. Even when you're not telling the officials, "Psst, I moved the ball." And that forgiving grace, upon true repentance, is received right here in the sacrament of Jesus' body and blood.